Hi, and welcome to week number 3 of Music Appreciation. I'm Arthur, and I'm ready to go, so just sit back, relax, and enjoy. Today, I'm continuing my overview of all the instruments in the orchestra. But first, review. Last time, I touched on the voice and how its ability to merge words and melody make it so special. I named the different sections of the modern orchestra, and I named 5. Do you remember what they are? Well, not in any particular order. We've got strings, woodwinds, brass, percussion, and keyboards. I also mentioned the conductor and his or her importance to a performing group. The conductor, remember, sets the tempo and shapes the overall interpretation of a piece of music and keeps everyone together. You also got a chance to conduct the Stars and Stripes Forever, one of my favorite tunes. And then I got through an introduction to the string section, giving you some samples of what the major string instruments sound like, including special sounds that they can make like pizzicato. And we started on the woodwind section of the orchestra. We recalled that the different instruments are not actually always made of wood, and we listened to what a flute and a clarinet sound like. So today I'm going to finish up the woodwind section. We'll listen to what the instruments sound like individually, and I'll tell you anything else interesting I can think of. We listened to the clarinet last time, that's true. And there's one more member of the clarinet family that I'd like to show you, the bass clarinet. It plays 1 octave lower than the normal soprano clarinet. It has an earthy sound. It can be used to create a mysterious or a sinister mood, among other things. Let's hear a little bit of the bass clarinet. And a little more. So like I said, mysterious, earthy, maybe even sinister sounding. That's the bass clarinet. There are many other sized instrument versions in the clarinet family. It's the same way in other instrument families. There is an E-flat clarinet that's smaller, an A clarinet just a tiny bit bigger than the standard, and at least 3 more larger clarinets. But in most cases, except for the higher or the lower notes that they can hit, there's not anything special about them. Composers want their pieces played, so they don't usually write for rarer instruments. And as we'll see, it's the same way in other instrument families like the saxophone. Now, I personally despise playing instruments with reeds like the saxophone. Every reed plays a little or a lot differently. You can't leave the reed on the horn for a day and then come back and play the instrument. You've always got to take off the reed and put it away, and then you've got to wet the reed before you play it again. It drives me up the walls. If you've played the saxophone, you know just what I'm talking about. But audiences love the saxophone. So I play the saxophone. The 4 most commonly used instruments in the saxophone family are, from left to right, the soprano, the alto, tenor, and finally the baritone. They all have different sized reeds and mouthpieces, but the same fingerings and similar embouchure. Now, embouchure is how you arrange your lips, teeth, and tongue to blow into a wind instrument. Now, you may already know that in jazz bands and Broadway pit orchestras, it's common for saxophone players to play clarinet and flute periodically during a show as well as for saxophone. They're able to do this a bit more easily because the fingerings for the three instruments are similar. Also, the embouchure for the clarinet and the saxophone is very similar. They're both played through a similar mouthpiece with a reed on the underside that rests on the lower lip. Remember the word embouchure. I'll be using that again when we take a look at the brass instruments. The saxophone was invented around 1840 by a Belgian named Adolphe Sax, hence the name saxophone. His goal was to develop an instrument with the projection of a brass instrument and the agility of a woodwind. So he was looking for a hybrid. Adolphe already played the flute, the clarinet, and he made chocolate already. I'm just joking. But he did play flute and clarinet. The saxophone never really got accepted as an orchestral instrument, possibly because it didn't blend well with the other instruments. You've probably heard saxophone before, but it probably sounded like this. Now let's listen to some classical saxophone. How does it sound to you relative to the big band saxophone you heard before? Does it sound maybe dark, hooty? Well, for one thing, it has a different timbre. The character of the sound is darker. There are fewer overtones in the classical saxophone sound than there are in the jazz and popular sound like In the Mood. In this case, the mouthpiece on the instrument makes all the difference. There are classical mouthpieces that tend to be darker and jazz mouthpieces that tend to be brighter. Here's something you don't hear every day. A saxophone quartet playing a famous classical tune by Bach. Now, this was arranged by someone else for a sax quartet. Saxophones weren't around when Bach was alive. I'd like you to listen to the musical word that gets passed around to each instrument throughout the piece. This repetition of a musical idea throughout a tune is called a fugue, from a Latin word for flight. The idea is the musical line seems to fly or move from instrument to instrument during the composition. Now that melody that we're going to hear in the fugue is this. Bum 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 bum. Listen for it. You'll hear it just by itself at the very beginning, and then it gets passed around to the different instruments, and then they start adding to it, and they make it more and more flowery, and it becomes this sort of musical chase. You'll hear the different instruments chasing each other around, playing that and other things. All right, let's give a listen. That's wonderful. Notice how the tune ended sounding happy? That was a G major chord, but the piece started in G minor, which is a sad key. It's one of those devices that composers use to subtly change how you feel. And that's what it's all about in my book. It's all about how the music makes you feel. All right, that's enough of the saxophone family. Now, the clarinet and the saxophone make a sound using a mouthpiece and a single reed. There are also double reed instruments that don't have a mouthpiece at all, starting with the oboe. I played oboe for about 5 weeks in junior high school. 5 very long weeks. I think we've all heard this instrument, but I'm going to play a couple clips anyway. The first one is lyrical with a lot of slurs. The second one jumps around a lot and is more staccato. Oboe is a difficult instrument in several ways. Remember embouchure? Embouchure is how you arrange your lips, teeth, and your tongue to blow into a wind instrument. The embouchure for oboe is more tiring than for saxophone because you're in effect having to squeeze a straw together with your lips alone. You can't use your teeth to bite. Now try that sometime with a soda straw for 30 seconds or so straight. Okay, that's not particularly fun. So oboe players have lips of steel. Also, most oboists make their own reeds. You can buy pre-made reeds, but in any event, they have to be manufactured by hand still. And the process involves cutting, slicing, shaving, wrapping, and a lot of play testing. And because you're dealing with a piece of wood, if you scrape off too much material while you're preparing your reed, pretty much your only option is to throw it away and start again with another piece of cane. You can't use wood filler on reeds because it changes how they vibrate. So oboe is definitely not an instrument for the faint of heart. The embouchure is strenuous, and you have to learn how to make your own reeds to be effective. So why would anyone want to play it? Well, for one thing, it sounds glorious. Second, a lot of people just love to play oboe. I can't blame them. I applaud them. On to the bassoon. Same type of embouchure as the oboe, but the inside of the instrument deserves a look. Here's a diagram of a bassoon. The player blows into the reed, marked 1 on the diagram, and the air flows down to the bottom of the instrument, makes a U-turn, and goes all the way back up and through the top. Being a double reed instrument, it needs handmade reeds like the oboe. I've never played one, but I would imagine the embouchure is a little easier than the oboe because it's not as tight. Do you remember the name of that piece, The Sorcerer's Apprentice? I've got something for you. The Sorcerer's Apprentice. What a great composition. Now, we put all the woodwinds together and we get a very cool sound. Each instrument in the woodwind section sounds more individual than instruments in the string section. And I'd like you to think about why. Here's a picture of the instruments in the string section. They all look the same, just different size, right? They all make their sound the same way. Now, let's take a look at the woodwind family. What a motley group. Not a single one of them looks the same except by color. And the oboe has one more reed than the clarinet anyway. There are three distinctly different embouchures represented here. With the flute, you direct a thin stream of air over an embouchure hole. The clarinet and the saxophone have mouthpieces and use one reed. The oboe and the bassoon have no mouthpieces at all, and you blow through two reeds lashed together. So the answer to the question, why do the instruments in the woodwind section sound more individual than the string section, is each instrument is significantly different. A cello sounds very much like a big violin because it's a big violin. So here is the woodwind section in all its glory. I've picked a passage where each major instrument piles on one at a time so you can hear it enter, starting with the piccolo. And the flute. Oboe. Clarinet. And finally bassoon. All right, that's the woodwind section of the orchestra. Next is the brass section. In a typical symphony, there are four types of brass instruments. Horns, also called horns in F, also called French horns. There are trumpets, trombones, and tubas. They all make their sound the same way. The player buzzes her lips into a mouthpiece, which makes a vibrating air column in the horn, which travels through the tube and finally out the bell. The bell is the flared end of the instrument. Here's a cross-section of a French horn mouthpiece, which is basically, as you can see, funnel-shaped. Brass players would say that it has a deep cup, and thus it has a dark sound. The other brass instruments I mentioned have a more of a teacup-shaped mouthpiece, like you see here. Brass players would say that it has a shallow cup, and thus a brighter sound. Now, big instruments play the lowest notes, and small instruments play the highest notes. We sort of accept that, right? But why is it true? Well, sound is a bunch of vibrations or waves that compress and decompress the air. And each molecule of air is close enough to the others that they sympathetically vibrate, however their neighbor does. So vibrations move lightning quick from air molecule to air molecule, from the source to your ear. And inside your ears are tiny hairs that are sensitive to a particular vibration's frequency. It's sort of like a forest of listening nerves, and each one is tuned to just one pitch. Now, by the way, this is how usually one loses one's hearing, gradually. Some of the hairs in your ear basically break off from overstimulation or disease. When that happens, it's like you can't hear that one pitch anymore. Audiologists call this a notch in your hearing. Okay, I'm getting off the track. It's what I do. Also, if you think about it, the fact that sound travels by sympathetically buzzing air or water molecules means that even though you wouldn't be able to test this, sound can't travel in a vacuum, like the vacuum of space. I always laugh when I'm watching science fiction shows when the bad guys get blown up with this huge kaboom in space. It would never happen. You'd hear nothing at all. Got to get back on track now. Why do big instruments play the lowest notes? Well, because the lower the note, the longer the sound wave is. And to make a note, instruments usually create waves inside the instrument, and then the sound waves squirt out somewhere on the horn. To play a low note, an instrument has to create a long wave, which requires a correspondingly long instrument to make that wave. Fortunately, curving the pipes on the instrument don't seem to make a difference in the pitch. So the tubes on brass instruments are curved around for convenience. If the pipe of an instrument like a trumpet was straightened out, it would be about 6 feet long. All right, it's time for you to sing along. And this time, I want, while you're singing, to listen for the flute and the clarinet, and the saxophone, the oboe, and the bassoon, those instruments in the woodwind section that we've been studying about today. Good job. I hope you recognized that the flute was playing the melody there along with you. Ba-ba-da, ba-da-ba-da, ba-da-ba-da, ba-ba-ba-ba. Okay, let's try one more. Great job, everyone. I'll see you next week. More music appreciation. Have a great one. Bye-bye.